out of the White River Junction area. We focus on a lot of different ecosystems, primarily in Vermont, but also across the region. I mostly work under this Vermont Atlas of Life with a mission of trying to document every species of everything that occurs in Vermont. We're up to 16,595 or something at last count. And this is also a web portal where you can explore your favorite species. In this case, the yellow-banded bumblebee. We can see phenology charts, pictures, descriptions, and you can dig down into the individual records and you can see this data that has been collected from projects like the Vermont Wild Bee Survey, which I'll be talking about today, but also from a large number of other projects, including citizen science observations from platforms like iNaturalist and eBird, if you're familiar with those. And that's what I'll say about VCE for now. And the rest of the talk will be about bees and why bees are maybe important. And these are two examples of why I'm here talking about bees and not talking about wasps or flies or land snails or something totally different, which would be equally interesting. But bees are particularly important for agriculture and for pollination of wild plants. This is a melon and a cucumber, or a zucchini, that as far as I can tell did not get adequate pollination. So you see on the side of this melon, there's very few seeds that formed, suggesting that not enough pollen reached that plant. And without any pollen, you wouldn't have a melon. And there's a number of our favorite fruits and vegetables that require insect-mediated pollination to set fruit. A lot of our diet, at least calorically, comes from wind-pollinated grasses like rice and wheat and corn that could care less about bees. But for some of the tastier, sweeter fruits and vegetables, insect pollination is very important, and bees are a large part of that, but not exclusively bee-pollinated. This is a video showing how a baby almond is made. This is a honeybee on an almond flower in California. These little yellow pom-poms are the male part of the flower. This green part is the female part. And you can see this bee as she gathers both nectar and pollen. The pollen grains get caught on her hairs, and some of them end up on this green sticky thing that then they travel down the tube and they pollinate the future almond. And you can also see on her hind leg here, she's got a little green daub of pollen that she's collecting to bring back to her hive to feed her offspring, or her mother's offspring in this case, but that's a whole other story. So, before I get any further, we're going to play a little game. Can I get a quick show of hands of who thinks this is a bee? It looks a lot like the one on the last slide. Looks like a bee. This is a bee. This is the western honeybee. How about this one? This one's fuzzy and familiar. This is the tricolored bumblebee. How about this one? Looks a lot like the first one. You guys are sharp. This is a fly pretending to be a bee. Wasp. Exactly, this is a wasp. The widow yellow jacket. So this one looks pretty similar, right? This is a bee, a nomad cuckoo bee, pretending to be a wasp. Another fuzzy one, pretty similar to that bumblebee. The fly pretending to be a bee. A robber fly. Totally different one. This is a bee, not trying to pretend to be anything else, as far as I can tell. Cuckoo bee. This one. This is a fly pretending to be a wasp. You can see the short, sort of clubby antenna, and it only has 2 wings, which is, bees and wasps all have 4 wings. Otherwise, it's a pretty good mimic. This one? Bicolored striped sweat bee. This is probably one of the most common bees in Vermont. I bet it's in 3/4 of your backyards. Super distinctive once you know what to look for. I'm sure you'll see it this summer. Looks like an ant, right? This is the mock orange scissor bee. Very strange bee. All right, this is the last one. This is what the squash longhorn cuckoo bee looks like for 11 months out of the year, and what the majority of our bees in Vermont look like for the majority of their life. This is the larval stage. You're never going to see it because it's underground in this case and in most cases, but this is how they spend a lot of their life. Underground, and I'll get to that. All right, so what are bees? Bees basically are vegetarian wasps. There's 7 families of bees that fall under the order Hymenoptera, which includes wasps, ants, sawflies, some other obscure insects. But bees are this distinct group that are unique in that they collect pollen as the primary protein source to feed their offspring. And this is important ecologically because in collecting that pollen, they are moving pollen grains from flower to flower, making them particularly efficient pollinators. All bees, at least female bees, somewhere on their body have these branched hairs, basically like split ends, that are an adaptation for gathering pollen grains. And I think through static electricity, the pollen is attracted to these branched hairs and stick on particularly well. The female bees move the pollen to their hind legs in some cases, or to their bellies, or there's a few other places where they carry pollen. They aggregate it from a couple hundred flowers, and then they take it back to the nest and they deposit it there. There's lots of other insects that you'll see on flowers, as I just showed you, but basically none of those are collecting pollen. They're just eating pollen themselves, or they're eating the nectar, which is this sugary substance the plants produce to attract pollinators. But bees are the only ones that are really moving that pollen around intentionally. Other insects are great pollinators and they accidentally collect pollen. Some of the moths, in particular, wasps, flies, spiders, hummingbirds, humans. Anything that goes from one flower to another can potentially be a pollinator. But bees are particularly important and maybe overemphasized, but they are an interesting group of pollinators that I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time. So for the last 5 years, myself and several others crisscrossed the state with a bunch of volunteers trying to figure out what bees were in Vermont. We really had no idea what was here 5 years ago when we started this project. We now know there's about 350 species that have been documented in Vermont in the last 100 years, in 39 different genera, 15 non-native species introduced from other places, including our very familiar, well-liked western honeybee, which I will talk about at the end of the talk. About 12% of bees in Vermont, of the species in Vermont, nest above ground. So in cavities in plants, in old stems, in holes in trees, in the side of your barn, variety of places, but the majority, the 88%, are nesting in the ground, which I'll talk about in a little while. And then what I find fascinating is that something like 25% of the species in Vermont are what we call pollen specialists, meaning they only collect pollen from a small number of plants. So this is a good example. This one here is a good example. This is the cranesbill miner, or the only place you're ever going to find that bee is on wild geranium flowers, which bloom for like a month in May. And like in the Champlain Valley, there's a lot of it. There's not a lot of it in eastern Vermont, central Vermont, but to find this bee, you have to go to wild geranium patches in May, and in all likelihood, you're going to find this one. And then the rest of the year, it's underground, and the offspring are underground in the nest in the vicinity of the wild geranium. This one is a specialist on sunflowers. This one is a specialist on willows. You need to find willows that are blooming in April to find that one. This is an aster specialist, so only active in September, October when the asters are blooming. I could go on and on and on. And I'll talk about a couple groups in a little bit more detail just to give you a sense. These are two bees. This is one species, the ground cherry fairy bee. The only way you're going to find this bee is if you find ground cherries, or if you plant tomatillos in your backyard. This species and several others in Vermont specialize on the flowers of plants in the genus Physalis. So tomatillos, the cultivated ground cherry, the wild ground cherry, which is a surprisingly common but rather obscure flower in Vermont. This is the wild ground cherry flower. It hangs upside down low in the understory of old overgrown fields not something you'd see unless you were really looking for it. But when you do find it, and you flip over the flowers, occasionally you'll find this ground cherry fairy bee in there, although it needs really sandy soils to nest. So it's limited in its distribution in Vermont. And the other thing that makes it hard to find is that it's very small, like half the size of a grain of rice. So this is a female on the shoulder of a tomatillo. So if you picture a tomatillo as like the size of a golf ball, she's sitting on the side of it. And those are individual pollen grains on her hind leg there.
Now, does she put those grains onto her leg, or do they accumulate because she's moving and touching?
As she visits the flower, the grains, I assume, accumulate on her body, and she moves them to her leg with her other legs. Most of the bees carry pollen like that on their hind legs. Some of them carry it on their belly. There's a couple species that carry it internally, but for the most part, it's on their hind legs. And that, backing up a second, that is, if you see an insect intentionally carrying pollen in like a big clump, you know it's a bee because they're the only ones that are moving pollen around like that. And you know it's a female bee. Males, as you might expect, do very little. This is another example of a pollen specialist. This picture was actually taken in my driveway when I was living in East Montpelier. All fall, I kept parking. There was one spot to park, and as I'd park, I noticed that there were bees nesting in the ground right below the car. And I was wondering what was happening as I was driving in and out every day. And then a year later, this paper came out showing that this species nests 3 feet down in the ground. So somebody dug out a whole nest and found that the nest itself was like a meter under the soil of the soil surface. And so each day she goes down the tunnel, starts a new little cavity, collects a ball of pollen. Probably takes her a good part of a day to collect enough pollen to make a little ball. She lays an egg on top, and then she seals it up. And then that egg hatches into a larva, and over the next month or so, that larva eats the pollen, and then turns into an adult, spends the winter and most of the next summer in that cavity, emerging just in time for the asters and the goldenrods to bloom in August of the following year. This is the northern aster miner. It's in the genus Andrena, which is a bunch of these specialists that I've talked about. So she'll never meet her offspring, but sort of every day that she's alive, she's active for maybe her month when she's laying eggs and building the food for her future offspring in this underground nest. It depends on the species, but in some species they mate in the fall, and they should only have to mate once. So the female can hold the male genetics for up to a year and use that to produce new offspring with. In some cases, in the case of this one, they mate right before she starts laying eggs when she first emerges. Some species like bumblebees, they emerge in the fall, they mate, and then they go underground to hibernate, and the males die, so only the queen female survives, emerging the next spring already fertilized and ready to lay eggs. This is another species of mining bee, Andrena alleghaniensis. This one, not particularly interesting, except for there's this associated red bee here. So this is the Allegheny miner, head first into her hole. You can see there's pollen on both her hind legs. So she's going in to deposit that pollen in her nest. And watch this red bee here that's waiting, and then flies a little closer down here. And then now the mining bee is underground, when the mining bee leaves, the red bee goes into the hole and lays her egg. And instead of the mining bee larva emerging, a year later, you get these nomad cuckoo bees coming out. Very similar to our cowbirds, if you're familiar with them, or the European cuckoos, which is where these get their name. They're birds that take over the nest of another species, lay an egg, and then that egg develops at the expense of the host larva, or bird in that case. Something like 25% of the species in Vermont are parasitic like this. So they're not collecting their own pollen, they're stealing the resources that other species collected. Fascinating. And then bees aren't the only other thing that like to eat bees. So like I said, they're vegetarians, they're herbivores. They form the base of a really complex food web that I just am able to scratch the surface of. This is a bee wolf. These things attack adult bees, paralyze them, bring them back into their nest, and lay their eggs there. It's a species of wasp. These are some mites on the back of a bumblebee that are maybe moving around between the nests, maybe eating detritus in the nest, maybe eating the larvae themselves. This is a crab spider that has grabbed onto the back of a mining bee. This is an internal parasite, a twisted-winged insect. Super fascinating. They spend their whole life inside of adult bees. And then a bee fly that lays its eggs inside of bee nests, sort of like the kleptoparasitic nomad bees. This is another species of fly that lays its eggs in midair, inserts an egg into the abdomen of a bumblebee, and then its larvae develop inside the bumblebee over the course of a month or so.
When you talk about nests in the ground, are we talking about a big cavity, or are we talking about lots of little tunnels that go out?
For the most part, most of the bees in Vermont are solitary. So, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but there's bumblebees, there's honeybees, and then everything else is more or less solitary. So it's just a female, she's mated, she builds a nest, she lays an egg, she closes that, she builds a new nest, lays an egg. And there might be a bunch of bees that are all nesting in the same area, but they're independent. So each female is just making her own cells in the ground. And on that note, let's take any quick questions, and then I'll move into the sort of the conservation half of this talk.
How does a parasitic bee benefit the ecosystem?
That's a great question. So they are visiting flowers to feed themselves. They're probably not very efficient pollinators because they're not collecting pollen, but might be hard to justify them from an ecosystem service standpoint of pollination, but I like to think of parasitic bees as a really good indicator of a healthy ecosystem. So if the higher the diversity and abundance of parasitic bees, that's an indication that there's a lot of healthy wild native bee populations. And they're a sort of a stabilizing factor in that they're never going to become more abundant than their hosts, but they're there to keep the host from getting too abundant at any one time. I think they're a fascinating indicator, if nothing else.
How many eggs might a female lay?
As far as I know, I might be wrong on this, but I think most bees lay about 1 egg a day, most of these solitary species. And some of them are active for maybe only 2 or 3 weeks a year in their whole life.
So I was curious, and you showed the picture of the bee pollinating the flower. And the question I had is, what percentage of the flower gets pollinated by itself versus what percentage gets pollinated by pollen that's carried by the bee from another flower to that flower?
That totally depends on the flower in question. So some species of flower can pollinate. If you have one flower, you can give it a shake and all the pollen will be released and it'll pollinate itself. Other plants, you have male and female flowers on separate plants. So you need something to move the pollen from one plant to the other plant. Sometimes it's wind, but in other cases, like blueberries and tomatoes are a good example where the pollen is only released when you buzz it at a certain frequency. I think it's supposed to be like a C minus. And the bumblebees have figured that out. So they have to shake the pollen off to get it to release, and then they move it to the next flower. So that you wouldn't get blueberries without this buzz pollination happening, or you'd get very few blueberries.
Nick-like insecticides?
I've got a whole, give me 3 slides and I'll get there. It's a hot topic right now, for sure. And that's a good segue to bee declines, and then I'll just touch briefly on this, and then I'll jump into some conservation things that we can do in our state and our backyards. So this is a paper that the Vermont Center for Eco-Studies put out 5 years ago now, looking at bumblebees in Vermont, showing that 3 of the 17 species that are here have declined rapidly in the late 90s, early 2000s. This is one of them, the yellow-banded bumblebee. Used to be pretty common in Vermont, now hard to find, although still around. There are a couple species that have totally disappeared from Vermont and are now on the federal endangered species list. And this was just looking at bumblebees because bumblebees are big and charismatic, and we had a little bit of data on them. Most of these other small bees, we don't have anywhere near enough data to do this kind of analysis. We're just sort of figuring out what's here now. But there's, at national and at select sites around the world, people have noticed declines in insect abundance and biomass and diversity, including in bees. It was big in the New York Times maybe 5 years ago, the insect apocalypse, colony collapse disorder, lots of concern about declining bees, primarily because of the impact on pollination of food systems. And I'm not trying to say that that's not at all valid, and it's definitely happening. In Vermont, for most of these species, we just don't have enough data to say anything about it. But it doesn't mean we can't take action to mitigate some of these threats that we see. So I'm going to talk about western honeybees for a minute. This is the species where we get all of our honey from. It's the bee that most people are familiar with. In Vermont and in the Northeast, it's basically an agricultural animal. So honeybees are to wild bees like chickens are to wild birds. They're domesticated. We're really good at making more of them. They're really important for agriculture. They've got cultural significance around the world, including in Vermont. And then 5 or 10 years ago, beekeepers started noticing colony collapse disorder, and it was harder and harder to keep their bees alive. And a lot of things were happening in their hives. What's surprising here in this figure is that this is 2000 to 2009 versus 2010 to 2020. This is the number of honeybee hives nationally in the thousands, and that's gone up. So there's more honeybee hives now than there were 20 years ago. And that's just because we're really good at making more, and we know they're important, and we can make more as needed. But what's telling on this figure is these hexagons is the pounds of honey harvested per colony, and that declined over the same time period, which suggests is that there's a decline in health and colony strength, which is what the beekeepers were noticing, and they were losing more colonies. They were having to start new colonies more often than they had been historically. And a lot of that is because of this mite, the Varroa mite, which was introduced from the old world sometime in the last 50 years. I don't remember exactly when. And then because of the importance to pollination and some crops in particular, there's a huge industry moving honeybees around. So you put them on the back of a flatbed trailer, start them, and this time of year they're pollinating almonds in California. And then when the almonds are done blooming in end of February, they'll put them on a trailer, they'll drive them up to Washington State to pollinate cherries, and then they'll go do blueberries in Michigan, and then maybe they'll go to Georgia for watermelon or something. And then they come to Vermont for the summer. Well, at least some of them come to Vermont for the summer. This is in 2022, roughly 14,000 hives were delivered into Vermont from out of state on these tractor trailer trucks. A lot of them went to Addison County, but they show up all over the place. And they're coming from these almond orchards. I guess I'll talk about that in a few slides. And then there's some serious concern among wild bee, native bee conservation folks about pathogen spillover from honeybees, especially from migratory colonies. This is a study from some UVM folks looking at deformed wing virus. It's a virus that affects honeybees and can also be detected in wild bumblebees. And so when the level of deformed wing virus was high in the wild-caught honeybees, it was also high in bumblebees. When it was low in wild honeybees here, it was low in wild bumblebees. And when they couldn't find any honeybees, they couldn't find any deformed wing virus in the wild bumblebees. So pretty strong indication of spillover happening in Vermont of this one virus that has some negative consequence for wild bumblebees. And then this is a map we put together of all of the registered honeybee hives in Vermont. And we made so there are gray circles around the center of where each hive is. And the circle represents the foraging distance, potential foraging distance of that colony. They can go like 2 or 3 kilometers from that backyard hive or from the commercial hive. Basically, the whole state has honeybees in it. They're almost all coming from managed hives, either in backyards or on farms or managed apiaries. There's a few places like the spine of the Green Mountains and the extreme reaches of the kingdom where there might not be a lot of honeybees. Question about neonicotinoids. Yeah, that's the next slide. There are a lot of other pesticides that are being used both agriculturally and residentially across Vermont and across the country. This is honeybees and bumblebees are in this family Apidae, particularly affected, but it affects all of the bee taxa in North America. So neonicotinoids are this fairly new, late 1980s or 90s, may or may not coincide with the decline of bumblebees, but they were introduced as a systemic insecticide that farmers could treat the seeds with. The whole plant is then toxic to pests, insects, and then they don't have to spray as much insecticide during the course of the growing season, easier to manage, theoretically less toxic to non-target organisms, i.e. not insects. There's some evidence of health issues in humans, but I won't go into that. In bees are insects, bees are herbivores. If bees are eating pollen from treated plants, there's strong evidence of both lethal and sublethal effects. So colonies are getting confused, health is declining, they're not as good at foraging as they used to be, and then there are plenty of direct mortality. There's enough coating on a seed, a single corn seed, to kill something like 80,000 honeybees. And those corn seeds are spread in May, and then it gets into the pollen, and when the corn is blooming in July probably, there are some honeybees out there collecting pollen from the corn. And it's not just honeybees. This is a fun wild bee native species, the two-spotted longhorn. Has been found on corn. The most frequent of the plants that it's been found on Vermont is corn. Although it visits a lot of other things, including cucumbers and peas and squash.
So when you say one coated seed can kill 80,000, are you talking about that pollen from the corn plant?
No, I think that the amount of neonic on that seed coating in a lab setting could be used to kill 80,000 bees. Not saying that any one corn plant is going to kill 80,000 bees, but all that's saying is it's a very highly effective toxin in the quantities that we're using it. And then, I should add though that last summer there was a bill passed through the House and State Senate that phases out the use of neonicotinoids on treated seeds, on ornamental plants, and a few other places, although you can still use it in your golf course, and there's a few exemptions. And hopefully there's some weird language in there that if a bill in New York that does the same thing is repealed, then the Vermont bill is repealed. So it's not totally a done deal, but hopefully by 2030, we won't be using it prophylactically in Vermont in row crops, which is the vast majority of the usage. All right, so other than running for the legislator and working on that bill, what can we do? A lot of it comes down to what we buy. So organic labels are great. I'll talk about that in a second. Other labels like this Vermont Audubon bird-friendly maple is a really cool project where they certify sugar bushes that have a more diverse forest. They manage for wildlife in addition to managing for maple. There's a lot of bees that really thrive in deciduous forests. So that's a good thing to look for. Tolerating apples that have a little bit of this fungal specking on it means that that apple was not treated with a fungicide, which has impacts on bees. And then I was looking for something to include on the slide. I found these 2 boxes of cereal in my pantry. One of them is organic, one of them is not. This one has honey. It should be good for the bees, right? There's not even a bee on the box. And then I looked at the ingredient list, and all of these ingredients that are highlighted in red are almost certainly grown with neonicotinoids somewhere in the world. I don't know where they're getting their things, but they've been banned in Europe. So if they're coming from Europe, which I kind of doubt, they might be neonic free. But oats and sugar beets, corn, canola and sunflower, flowering crops that are often treated with neonicotinoids, almonds, which I can talk about in a second, I think, and then honey, which we just talked about. This is on the neonic level. This is some UVM folks that were studying honeybee pollen across Vermont and sampling for neonics in that pollen that the honeybees were bringing back to their hives. And right after the corn and soy was seeded in mid-May, this is the planting window, the bee colonies that were near high percentage of agricultural land were bringing back a lot of these two neonicotinoids. But after the planting was done, they weren't picking up as much in the environment. So they're potentially picking up the neonics from the seed coatings or from the dust that's coming off of the tractor that's spreading the seed coatings in May. And then it's probably landing on adjacent plants and it's ending up in the colonies. So even if they're not visiting the corn itself, they're still bringing in neonics in areas where there's a high percentage of agricultural land. So I meant sunflower on that ingredient list. It's a lot of oils. I wouldn't have expected it in Cheerios, but there it is. And this is a study, I don't know, somewhere in the US looking at this is a sunflower specialist, so it only visits plants in the sunflower genus for its pollen needs. And you can see here strong declines in abundance of both the specialist and wild bees in general on sunflowers that are treated with one of these neonicotinoids. Almonds, I spent some time in the Central Valley one spring where looking at pollination of these giant almond orchards. Thousands and thousands of acres that look like this. It's great right now, it's got lots of flowers, there's bees all over the place. All honeybees, it turns out, because as soon as the flowers are done blooming, there's nothing in that landscape to support bees anymore. So you take the honeybees away and there's nothing going on because there's no flowers in the understory, the trees aren't flowering, there's no wild vegetation around. So you need to bring in the honeybees because there's not wild pollinators that can do the pollination. And almonds is one of those crops where you need to have pollen moved, in this case between varieties. So they plant different varieties in each row so that the bees are moving the pollen back and forth. So without bees, you definitely don't have almonds. But the almonds are not doing any favors to the bees, especially because every time it rains during the bloom, they fly over with a plane and they drop fungicides to prevent various diseases from getting into the almond flowers. And I don't think they're using neonicotinoids on almonds, but they're using other fungicides, I think, are the main one. There's probably some insecticides being used as well. So these bees that are coming to Vermont potentially have been, in February, were in California getting bombed with fungicides while eating nothing but almonds for 2 weeks. And you can imagine what that does to anybody eating one thing for that period with no other flowering available. Moving on from honeybees and from pesticides, this is a simple one that I think is ripe for action at the local scale and for potentially some state legislation. But right now you can go online, you can search mason bees for sale, and you can order 100 or 1,000 of these little cocoons and bring a bunch of mason bees into your backyard, in theory to support pollination of your couple apple trees or to help save the bees. You can bring in bees and you can let them go in your yard. Unfortunately, you get these cocoons and you really don't know what's inside of them. Sometimes wasps can come out, parasitic wasps. Sometimes there's fungus in there that could be spreading to wild mason bees. It's a pretty unregulated industry right now. It's pretty new, and it's targeting backyard homeowners. It's not really makes sense at an agricultural land scale, but it's for the backyard gardeners. And I think there's a lot more risk than there is benefit, especially in Vermont, where we have a decent population of wild mason bees and other bees that are able to do almost all of the backyard pollination we might need. Landscaping is another thing that we can all approach at some level. Obviously, there's not a lot of bees going on in this lawn. Maybe there's clover, but if you mow it every week, there's probably nothing flowering. That's a whole acre of nothing in terms of from a bee perspective. A nice cottage garden with a variety of loosestrife, and this is the red bee balm, gooseneck loosestrife, I think. There's definitely bees there, probably a lot of the generalist bumblebees, probably honeybees. But none of these plants are native to this region, so you're not going to get a lot of the fun specialists. But if you switch this red bee balm for the pink wild bergamot, which is in the same genus, looks just as nice and is native to this region, then you have a chance of getting bees like this bee balm shortface that you're only ever going to find on wild bergamot. It doesn't like the cultivated red bee balms. There's a bunch of examples of that. Swamp milkweed could have fun wild bees on it. There's a bunch of native species that you can replace with the common garden varieties and increase the bee diversity in your landscape. And then soft landings is a concept that people are pushing right now, where you, around the base of a single tree, you leave a bunch of wild sort of flowering plants and leaf litter and a place for the bees to nest that's undisturbed. You can add some shade-tolerant flowers that bring in bees like this cranesbill miner, the wild geranium specialist, and it's a place mostly for bees to nest and for caterpillars and other insects to complete their life cycle if they're falling out of the trees and they'd rather have a nice cushion of leaves than a lawn or a sidewalk. And obviously bees need places to nest. Like I said, about 12% of them are above ground. Some of these you can get encouraged to nest in your backyard with bee hotels, although I encourage big bee hotels that last for many years and aren't well maintained can become breeding grounds for disease. So it's something to be careful of, although I think they're a really valuable educational opportunity, especially for schools and school groups and in downtown settings. But better yet, just leave a bunch of your dead stems in your garden from the year before. Bees like the small carpenter bee will climb in there, lay their eggs, and these are the pupa that are in a mint or a goldenrod stem. Anything that's hollow, sunflowers, some of the shrubby things like sumac and elderberries have lots of bees nesting inside of them. So leaving those to the extent you are comfortable with, especially over the winter, and cutting them in April or May instead of in September, has great benefits for nesting habitat for a lot of wild bees. And then native flowering plants. This QR code is a better list that you guys can look at, but here's a few of my favorites. Things that can be grown in backyards that provides food for specialists and for generalist bumblebees and honeybees and just about everybody. Some more links, some of our work, and then I think I will take questions. And thanks to all the people that worked on this project. There's more than just me behind all this work, and it's been a great team effort for 5 years now. Vermont Center for Eco Studies is just getting started on a lot of this going forward. Do I have questions? No? Yeah, you can turn the light on.
Can you go back to the list?
That's a great idea.
Can I see the next slide? Have you done any studies of bee communication?
That's beyond my area of expertise. And there's some cool stuff with honeybees, and there's some fascinating biology happening within the colonies, but for another time, another speaker.
And are putting chunks of dead tree, old logs around useful to some bees?
Yeah, there's a handful of species that nest in rotting logs, probably a dozen species that I can think of off the top of my head that excavate they follow an old insect hole, or they dig their own hole, and that's where they nest or where they spend the winter.
Is the number 350, the species, is it comparable to something like 100 years ago, do we know, or?
We don't really know. When we started this project, the list that I was given from somebody was like 270, and we've since found a bunch of them. There's 22 species that we have not seen in the last 5 years. You guys, okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so 22 species we haven't seen in the last 5 years. There's probably another 20 that are here that we haven't found yet. There's some that have shown up in the last few years. There's a couple cases of bumblebees that are well-documented declines that we know have disappeared. But other than that, we really can't say.
Can you talk a little bit more about the traveling bumblebees? Like, is that somebody's business? And do you pay people to bring them here?
So you're saying traveling honeybees. Bumblebees are another thing that travel that I'll talk about briefly. But yeah, honeybees are the ones that are on tractor trailers that people bring to almond orchards and to blueberry pollination. And yeah, the farmers, because they need the pollination from the bees to have an almond crop, they'll pay per hive to have them deposited in their orchard. And it's actually more lucrative for the farmer than the honey that they're producing. The pollination services are they're able to charge for. And then briefly on bumblebees, you can buy a box of bumblebees. It's a little bit regulated at this point. They come from Michigan, and you get a box. You put it in your greenhouse, or in other places where there aren't wild bees, for pollination of tomatoes and blueberries and things that honeybees aren't very good at pollinating. So there's a need for commercial bumblebees in a few small examples.
Why do they have to be kept away from wild?
The bumblebees? The main concern, anytime you're moving insects around, is diseases. Bacterial, fungal, viral, and then mites and pathogens that are potential. You put out a bunch of things in one place, there's a lot of disease spread and build up, and then you take it out and disperse it across the landscape. I guess that's it.
Interesting creature, bee-like, with a really bright orange band across the middle of it that I've seen lately. I didn't see it in any of your illustrations.
I'm wondering if it wasn't not a wasp. It's not ringing any bells for bees, but.
It's fat like a bee, but.
Anything like that, the best option is try to get a picture of it with your cell phone or camera and put it on iNaturalist. It's this online website where you can upload photos, and then experts from around the world will go through and they'll tell you what it is. And then that data is then used for projects like this.
I remember in the last year that a couple different tractor trailer loads of bees overturned in Maine in this state. What happens, do the hives just like disperse, or?
When they tip over?
Yeah.
I would imagine the beekeepers would do their best to contain the hive, and as long as the queen stays in the hive, they should be able to get it back and move it to wherever it was going. Of the whatever 100,000 bees that are in the hive, only one is actually reproducing, and is the queen. And if the queen dies, the colony dies. If you lose the queen, the rest of the bees will live 2 weeks, and then that'll be the end of the colony. So in the case of a spill, unlikely that they would spill over into the environment that way.
Are these traveling bees, are they making honey at the same time they're doing all this pollinating?
They're making, that honey then is full of,
And the people take the honey?
right, but it's full of neonicotinoids and fungicides and whatever else the bees are exposed to. So
So the bees that come to Vermont, I guess I assume there are some from here. Do we see any negative effects from that?
yes, they don't like making a big deal of it, so it's hard to find data on where the bees are coming from and what they're doing here and how long they're here. There was one study that a few colleagues worked on where they found some negative effects, and I think my understanding of the story is that some industry group was able to shut down the publication of it, but there are likely effects both on the health of the bees themselves and of the bees in the surrounding area.
So are they generally affecting like what's happening to the bees here?
We don't have enough information to know. I mean, we can speculate, but we don't have enough population data. You'd have to do a pretty controlled study to be able to say definitely, but I imagine so. Let's go over here for a few.
Could you do a top 5 things that people in this room, if they want to aid bees, could do on in their yard?
Yeah. Native shrubs, you get a lot more bang for your buck in terms of number of flowers per stem. Willows and dogwoods and things that fit in an urban landscape and have a lot of flowers. Not on your backyard, but buying organic fruit. Things that have flowers that are likely to be sprayed by chemicals are the biggest concern. Corn and wheat we're not going to get away from conventional corn or wheat anytime soon. And if it's not flowering, the bees maybe aren't visiting it that much. So organic vegetables, produce. Not spraying insecticides in the backyard. And I think this comes up a lot now with ticks and with mosquitoes. So with the Triple E outbreaks in the Chittenden County this year, there was a lot of concern about people spraying their backyards with general insecticides. And the labels say you're not supposed to spray on flowering plants, and I've heard that a lot of the applicators, at least other parts of the country, totally ignore that. And then there's a lot of tick treatments that people are doing for ticks, which understandable because Lyme disease is quite scary. And VCE has actually got a cool project right now looking at the effect of those on other insects. And maybe it doesn't seem to be as bad as we originally thought, but something to consider. And then the last thing I'll say is, if you're buying plants, pollinator plants for your backyard, it's best to ask the nursery or figure out if they're treated with neonicotinoids, because or other systemic insecticides. A lot of nurseries, the bigger ones especially, are treating the plants with something that makes them toxic to caterpillars and to mites, and so they don't have to deal with. So they look nice at the garden center, and they don't have holes in them. But then you bring that back to your yard, meaning well, and that pollen then is potentially toxic for years after you plant it. And it's hard to get information from nurseries about what they're using because a lot of them are buying them from other places, and there's a whole chain there that's a little bit opaque. But that's a good thing to think about when you're buying these plants for your yard.
Could you talk a little bit about how you use citizen scientists in your work?
Yeah, so we had, I didn't even really get into it in this talk, but we collected something like 60 or 70,000 bee records for Vermont in 5 years. And most of those were collected by citizen science, either working directly as volunteers or through iNaturalist. iNaturalist is now our biggest data source. A lot of those pictures you saw and a lot of the distribution and phenology we know about bees in Vermont is because of people like you with smartphones in their backyard. Oh, I wonder what that is. And you put it on the app, and a week later we realize it's a species we haven't seen in Vermont before, and we add it to our list.
No queen bee lives forever. What is the procedure or the process by which new queen bees are produced? Do they always make their own new hive? Or does an old hive somehow produce its own new queen bee?
That's a whole field that I'm only tangentially familiar with, but and so that only applies to honeybees. The other bees, bumblebees have queens that are produced every year at the end of the summer. The solitary bees are just producing males and females that do their own separate and live only for a year. Honeybee queens live for like 6 years, and their colonies are able, there's triggers in the colony somehow that tell them to make new queens, and they feed them a special honey, and that indicates them to grow into queens, basically, is the simple version that I understand. And there's ways to manipulate that to make new queens so that you can just buy a queen to put in your hive to repopulate one that dies.
Is it really possible to buy organic, commercial honey with all of the interaction that you just described?
That's a great question, and I should look into that because I don't know if anyone is certifying it, and if they are, how they would certify it. Because the question is whether or not you can buy commercial organic honey.
It's not tainted.
Right, because the bees are, you don't know what the bees are foraging on, and they could be foraging in your neighbor's yard where they have a treated hydrangea bush or something. Hadn't thought about that one before, but I imagine it's really hard to be sure. Certainly, the small-scale beekeepers in this part of the state and that are where they're not next to huge monocrops of corn are likely to be, the vast majority of that's going to be organic or not have a lot, there won't be a lot of nasty things in there, but you never know, I guess.
You know if there's a plan for the state to plant flowers along the interstate?
There's I've been part of some ongoing email threads about people that are trying to get that to happen. There's a Department of Transportation grant to look at doing it in like rest areas and parking rides. It's a low-hanging fruit for increasing pollinator habitat. Even just by changing mowing regimes, you can get different plants to bloom. And trying to avoid using herbicides would be nice. But I don't know of the current efforts.
I have like 3 questions. iNaturalist, is that the letter I in the word naturalist,
Yeah.
or is EYE naturalist?
Aye.
Second thing, is a drone and a worker bee the same thing?
Drones are males. Workers are all females. So the drone's whole purpose is to fertilize the queen. the workers are 99% of the honeybees you see are workers. The drones come out at the same time the queens come out, theoretically, and they leave the colony and they never come back. And they try to find a queen from another colony to mate.
My third question is, if a bee stings you, does it die?
If a honeybee stings you, it dies. Other bees are usually okay. So, as I meant to put a slide in there about this. Honeybees are these giant colonies that are really different than anything else. And the workers are more genetically, complicated genetics, but they're closer related to their mothers than they would be to their sisters than they would be to their own offspring. So their biological incentive is to defend the queen at the expense of themselves. So they have these barbed stingers that when they sting you, the stinger rips out and they pump venom into you for a while. And they're also much more aggressive than our wild bees. I've been stung by plenty of wild bees. Usually it's when I'm walking around the yard barefoot and step on them. Male bees don't have stingers. You're never going to get stung by a male. Half of the native bees are too small to break your skin. So it's bumblebees and honeybees that are the majority of what's ever stung me. Most of them are being honeybees. But bumblebees don't have the barbed stinger, so they're not going to pull out. It's not going to rip out. The bee will be fine. And they're not as aggressive because they are more concerned about their own survival than that of the colony.
So how do you feel like a little bit more about the difference between like domesticated honeybees and wild bees? Like, should people be having hives and like, is there a way to like semi-domesticate wild bees so you could get honey?
Honeybees are the only species in this part of the world that produces honey. And I'm not going to tell you to get honeybees to save bees. That was sort of a popular perception for a long time, was that I'm going to save the bees, I'm going to get a couple honeybee hives. It's like getting chickens to save turkey vultures or some rare bird that you want to save. I will say that there's a lot of things that beekeepers do to improve pollen and habitat in their landscapes that are also beneficial for wild bees. So they have sort of there's similar things that you would do for both, but the act of keeping bees by itself is at best neutral to wild bee populations. And depending on how well they're managed, it can be potentially harmful. But they can be well managed, and I'm not opposed to honeybee keeping at a small scale in the right context.
Any comments about no mow May?
I think it's been a great conversation starter, and it's a step in the right direction. Dandelions are most of what you're going to get. European species that has questionable value to wild bees. It's valuable for honeybees. I've heard conflicting things about the quality of the pollen for a lot of our wild bees. If your yard's got a lot of violets and wild strawberries and what's the other one that I like to see a lot of? The clover or hawkweed, then that's a really nice, easy way to increase the diversity in your yard. Hawkweed. It's the old name, I think, of Indian paintbrush. It's like a red.
Oh, Indian paint.
Yeah.
That's later in the season, though.
June, maybe June, there's some species that are blooming. And mowing higher is you're going to get bring the blade up an inch and you get a whole nother thing of violets and clovers, and certainly doesn't hurt.
One last question.
Yeah.
About, you may have addressed this earlier. Are honeybees found in almost every place in the world?
We got really good at moving honeybees around. They're originally from Eastern Europe, Western Asia. I think they're on all continents now. They've been in Vermont probably for 300 years, if not longer. There's 4 species in the genus, and there's a few places in the tropics where there are other bees that are producing honey, but the western honeybee has got to be the most widespread bee, if not insect, in the world. Yeah, so it's about time, but I'll stick around for questions afterwards if folks want to ask a few. One more, maybe?
Well, you were listing, and I don't remember all of it. Hawkweed, violets, clovers,
Wild strawberry.
wild strawberry, okay.
All right.